It sits on every table, either in a shaker or a salt-based condiment. Salt adds flavor to our favorite foods and is essential for chefs worldwide. But for most of human history, it's been so much more than that. Salt determined where our earliest ancestors settled, how our civilizations developed, and how our species survived. Thanks to salt, great empires would prosper and legendary cities would be destroyed. It's referenced in religion, mythology, literature, and philosophy, and it tells the story of everything from the founding of China to the French Revolution. Today, we're diving into its history, exploring its discovery, trade, and expansion, and tracking down just a few of the countless dishes that have defined its incredible impact. This is the story of salt. Have you ever noticed how much salt comes up in everyday conversation? I'm not even talking about in a food context, just in how we speak in normal life. If we're not sure about something, we take it with a grain of salt. Storing something for safekeeping means salting it away. A hard worker is worth their salt. A good person is salt of the earth, and someone with experience is said to be seasoned. Or an old salt, but for us old guys, well, please don't rub salt into the wound. Salt is all around us. In cooking, of course, from the salt and pepper shakers on restaurant tables to salted caramel milkshakes to this guy. But salt, or its chemical compound of sodium chloride, is also part of the process of making leather and turning wood pulp into paper. It gives us chlorine, which sanitizes our swimming pools, goes into manufacturing PVC piping, and even vinyl records. Salt is used to strengthen soil for building roads and then sprinkled on top to keep them open when there's snow and ice. You can find salt in toothpaste and cleaning supplies, used to remove rust from metal and stains from wooden tables. It's a disinfectant, a natural pain reliever, and throughout history it's been valued for everything from medicine to mummification. But most of all, of course, there's its use in food. The most indispensable item in any restaurant kitchen. Every cuisine uses salt, all of them. I mean, sure, in some Asian countries, the salty flavor might come from soy sauce, but that's made by fermenting soybeans in salt. Or maybe a dish gets its seasoning from pickled vegetables, which are, you know where this is going. You can find salt in almost any sauce. Ketchup, mustard, you name it. In fact, the word sauce comes from the Latin sal, as in salt. And that word sal is also the root of salsa, meaning salted, salad from herba salata or greens with salt, and sausage, meaning preserved in salt. So how did something so essential, so ingrained in our diet, our lives, and even our vocabulary first enter our shared frame of knowledge? Well, maybe the best place to start is with the fact that we need salt. We literally can't live without it. In our basic chemical composition, a healthy person is about 0.4% sodium chloride. It's a small number, but just like when a pinch is added to food, a little bit goes a long way. Salt carries nutrients into our cells. It transmits impulses to our nerves and to our muscles, keeps our electrolytes in balance, and makes sure our heart keeps beating. To the first humans, the hominids that appear in the fossilized record a few million years ago, well, they didn't know they needed salt to survive. They were hunters, and they got what they needed from their diet. See, animals need salt too, and they get plenty from things like groundwater, which gets into their flesh, and that meant that for us, a meat-heavy diet took care of our salt requirements. But when much of the world began farming and moved into the first permanent settlements, when all of a sudden we could fill up on grains and vegetables, well, there was something important that became lacking in our daily rations. Agriculture might have enabled us to advance, but if we were going to survive, well, we'd need salt too. And that's how this story begins. Around 12,000 years ago, the very beginning of the so-called Neolithic period, and just as humans began to unlock the mysteries of farming, a small band of hunter-gatherers settled in one single location, quite possibly for the first time in world history. They built round houses out of clay about 5 meters across. They planted wheat, barley, and even fig trees. And as their village grew, they developed folk legends and stories told in a language that would become the root of everything from Hebrew to Arabic to dialects covering much of North Africa. The location of Jericho made sense. It was right next to a natural spring which allowed irrigation and attracted animals for easy hunting. But there was something else significant right next to this site, and that's the Dead Sea, a body of water with such salinity that its beaches are made of salt. And this wasn't a coincidence. When we look at where the first human settlements were built, all of the ones we know about, a pattern starts to emerge. They were always built with access to both fresh water and salt. The first city to surpass Jericho in size would be Çatalhöyük in today's Turkey. It was also constructed next to a salt lake, and here we see the first examples of salt production, as water found from the lake would be boiled in clay pots so the salt would be left behind by evaporation. Along with these pots, by the way, archaeologists also found, and this sounds crazy, an 8,000-year-old salt shaker. Primitive salt production was also taking place by the same time in Solnicata in today's Bulgaria, which as far as we know was the first settlement in continental Europe. And within the next millennia, we see both settlements and salt extraction across much of the ancient world. Along coastlines, people were boiling seawater or digging pools to allow it to evaporate in the sun. And the most incredible finds might be in both today's Austria and China's Sichuan province, where by 5000 BC, mine shafts were dug as deep as 200 meters underground to harvest salt from deposits. As a side note, by the way, that mine in Sichuan didn't just uncover salt. It also introduced the world to natural gas, which the Chinese would burn as a heating source, the first discovery ever recorded of fossil fuel. Now, from these settlements, we know that early humans were drawn to salt. What we don't know is why. The most common theory is that when we stopped surviving on a meat-based diet, our bodies developed a strong affinity for a salty flavor to signal to us what we needed to eat. As proof, look at our taste buds, which are varied and complex and recognize a lot of different flavors, but all of them include this thing called type 1 cells, which are salt receptors, signaling to our brain when we taste something salty. And this is how we knew where to settle. But something about that doesn't make sense. All throughout history, evolution, adapting new senses and abilities, that takes time. Tens of thousands of years in even the fastest examples. The idea that the minute we skipped a meal of elk or venison and had a bowl of porridge, our bodies simultaneously sent us to the salt mines is ridiculous. Not to mention, how was it that we knew where to find the stuff in the first place? There has to be another explanation. And there is. One that when you think about it is actually incredibly obvious. And to find a clue, we need to head back to where we started. Jericho. Or since we're filming in Bangkok, at least as close as we can get, which is the city's only Israeli grocery store. And that's where we'll start our day. Daria, this is sort of your thing, so show me the right way to do this.
Okay. Welcome to my snack channel.
To figure out why humans settled near salt, let's look at how the first settlers of the Dead Sea actually used the stuff. It wasn't a condiment, it was a preservative, making stuff just like this, fish packed in salt, extending its viability from a few hours to weeks, months, or even years. The thing about salt that made it so valuable to the earliest agrarian settlers wasn't its flavor. That wouldn't explain why all primitive towns were built near sources. It wasn't its nutritional value. As we mentioned, they'd have no way of knowing its importance. It was its ability to preserve foods by drawing out moisture. And the fact that we were taking advantage of that utility from as far back as the start of the archaeological record gives a pretty good clue that even before the invention of agriculture, We already knew all about salt and where to find it. We even know how that might have happened, with modern historians theorizing that inland tribes would have followed animals to salt deposits and salt lakes, and people on the coast would dig pools to allow seawater to evaporate in the sun. And that's actually not controversial. We know from fossilized remains that tens of thousands of years before Jericho, hunter-gatherers were pretty good at food preservation. They were smoking and drying their proteins. And the only reason we can't prove that they were salting them too is that salt is in pretty much all fossils because it's so prevalent in our environment. We can't prove they used it, but we know. And the most amazing thing about how they used it is that the basic idea hasn't changed in tens of thousands of years. Things like salted fish helped our oldest ancestors survive in times of famine, and it still helps us now in the same way. Like for Daria, who grew up with this stuff as a child in Russia's Far East, in the lean times around the fall of the Soviet Union.
So we would eat it with something pickled. Usually it's like pickled cucumber, just sliced. This one is a little bit big, but I think it's still gonna be good. All right. Good.
Salty. All right, as we move forward in this story, let's go back one more time to the ancient city of Jericho. On a map, it's here, but you'll also notice another ancient city just 18 miles to the southwest, another place with something of an important history of its own, the city of Jerusalem. And that brings us to my favorite part of making these history videos, when we get to dive into an entire world of myths, legends, and stories. There are no less than 47 references to salt in biblical texts, from Matthew calling his followers the salt of the earth, to the book of Leviticus teaching that salt should be included in all sacred offerings, to the famous story of Lot, whose wife was turned into a pillar of salt. To the Israelites, salt was said to represent the covenant between God and man, with salt representing eternity thanks to its use as a preservative. To this day on the Shabbat, Jews dip bread in salt to represent that covenant. And to Christians, salt would be of equal importance. I mean, did you ever notice that in the Last Supper, Judas has just knocked over a bowl of salt, the darkest omen of what was to come? And holy references to salt are not limited to Israel. There's a story from India about the Buddha, who compared the impact of karmic misdeeds to adding a grain of salt to a cup of water versus the great Ganges River. To Japanese followers of Shinto, salt wards off evil spirits, which is why even today before a sumo wrestling match, the fighters throw salt into the center of the ring. And then there are the people of the Americas, who have their own versions of salt mythology, with maybe the wildest coming from the Hopi of what's now the southwestern United States, who according to their tradition worship a salt goddess who's reincarnated as a member of the tribe. And that's why prior to any salt gathering expedition, the tribesmen would spend time with her to ensure a successful mission. Anyway, we could keep going with stories about the importance of salt, but maybe even more fascinating are some of the myths about how it was created in the first place. Here there are hundreds of ancient fables, from the Chinese legend of salt being delivered by the phoenix, to the Hindu story crediting the sweat of Vishnu himself, to the Assyrians, who believed the earth began when the salt goddess married the god of fresh water. But since we need to keep moving, I'm gonna limit myself to my three favorites. We'll start with a Slovakian folktale about an ancient king who was choosing between three daughters to be his successor. Now, he was a vain king, so he decided that they should all profess their love for him, and then he'd decide who could follow him to the throne. His eldest daughter spoke first and told the king she loved him more than gold. The second daughter said she loved him more than precious gems, and his youngest, the Princess Marushka, said that she loved him more than salt, which makes life possible. Well, to the king, this was a terrible insult. I mean, it's just salt. It's hardly royal. Even the peasants had salt. So he banished Marushka from the kingdom. Offended by this punishment, the salt god cursed the realm and turned every grain of salt into gold. At first, the king was thrilled, but his people soon began to revolt because their food had become tasteless, and also because they relied on it as a preservative, and now they were all getting sick. Eventually, Marushka returned to the kingdom carrying a gift from the son of the salt god, her new husband. It was a bag of infinite salt, which she presented to the people on her arrival, and in gratitude, the king, who now understood its incredible importance, named her his successor. The next story comes from the Philippines. According to this one, a very long time ago, people had to cross the ocean to get their salt from a magic mountain far away. But one day, with their supply almost gone, the ocean was violent and too dangerous for their boats to cross, so they went to visit a giant named Angalo. Now, Angalo was benevolent and offered to help, so he took an enormous step across the ocean and stretched his legs to create a bridge. The men and women ran across carrying their baskets for collection, but when they were on their way back, carrying as much salt as they could hold, Angalo realized his foot was resting on an anthill, and stinging red ants began to attack his flesh. In a panic, he dipped his leg into the ocean and everyone fell into the water. One by one, he rescued each villager, but their salt had dissolved, and that's how the ocean became salty. For our last one, we turn to Norse mythology. There are lots of versions of this tale found from Scandinavia all the way to Asia, but the basic idea is that a sailor traveled to the far north, where he found a mysterious old man selling massive blocks of salt. He loaded them into his ship's hold and headed back towards home, excited for the money he could make with this special product. On his way back, he encountered a tremendous storm and was blown off course onto a strange island, where in a forest he saw a magician using a mill to grind stones into a fine powder. The sailor thought to himself, wow, with this mill I could divide the salt into small portions and make an even bigger profit. So he waited for the magician to go to sleep, then stole the mill and took it to his boat. The next day as he sailed away, he began to grind his salt. This worked like a charm, but it worked so well he couldn't figure out how to get the machine to stop. It ground so much salt it began to fill the entire ship, and soon enough, the boat was sinking. As the captain and his men evacuated, they saw their boat go under the water and heard the mill continue to grind, and since that day, the ocean has been filled with salt water. Anyway, thank you for indulging me. Now let's get back to the history. For the first 9,000 years after the advent of agriculture, people tended to live in small communities, scattered around the planet and not widely organized into major civilizations. But by the year 3000 BC, that was changing. And with that change came the onset of the spice trade. This was roughly when we start to see ingredients begin to move and currency start to change hands. And of all the commodities known to man, nothing was more valuable than salt. But its trade wasn't as simple as you might imagine. First, there just wasn't much of it. Even coastal towns could only produce so much, as boiling or evaporating a kilogram of seawater only yields about 2 tablespoons of the actual substance. To get 1 single cubic meter of salt, you'd need to utilize 64,000 kilos of salt water. And second, even if you did all that, salt is a mineral. It's not like other spices which can be dried, bagged, and shipped on camel or horseback. It's heavy. That same cubic meter of salt weighs around 2 metric tons, 4,700 pounds to be specific. It would take 30 horses to carry its combined weight. Now you can see why it was so expensive. Anyway, this isn't to say that nobody tried to sell the stuff. I mean, the price made it irresistible. Early Chinese kingdoms sold salt to each other and neighboring polities, and the biggest salt traders were the Celts, who built an empire from whatever riches they could gain from their mines in Austria around a city we now call Salzburg. But with a price so astronomical and availability so limited, even those who did manage to mine and move it only sold to the elite, royalty, and so on. There certainly wasn't enough on the open market to feed a growing population or allow us to finally build towns without first finding a source of salt. It would remain like this for another 1,000 years, until we see the biggest breakthrough in the history of salt commerce, courtesy of the ancient Egyptians. Now, like the Chinese and the Celts, the Egyptians were salt traders, but this wasn't a critical product, as again, it was just too hard to move. Instead, their revenue came mostly from their fisheries around the Nile, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. They sold salt, the little bit that they could produce and carry, and they sold fish, at least to nearby ports, so it could arrive fresh. And that was how the economy would work until around 2000 BC, when someone had an idea, one that would change the world. What if they thought we stopped selling our excess salt and use it to preserve this abundance of fish, so it'll hold long enough to sell further away, and with a substantial increase in price, too? I mean, after all, that's what the salt was gonna be used for anyway, so let's just simplify the process. In retrospect, it was a no-brainer, but at the time, this was revolutionary, and it made Egypt incredibly rich. Soon, Egyptian salted fish was found on tables anywhere their boats or caravans could reach, and more societies would follow, with fishing and farming villages springing up to supply salt mines supplying factories aging and brining fish, meat, and vegetables, and ports and trading posts sending those goods to towns and cities, which could finally, for the first time, exist almost anywhere. The beginning of the modern world and history's first real supply chain. Of all of the outcomes of this breakthrough, one of the most exciting was that soon, civilizations were exporting not just salted fish and meat, but their own unique takes on salt-based recipes. To stand out in the market and to attract buyers, we see competition in making the best salted stuff, and it would have an unbelievable impact on cuisine. Before long, we see the spread of all kinds of things that had previously only been made within small communities, like sausages, first sold by the Assyrians from Mesopotamia, salted olives, also from the Egyptians and soon favored throughout the Mediterranean. Chinese salted cabbage would reach as far as Europe, where it would eventually become known as sauerkraut. And those Celts again, well, they took the hint and changed course from selling salt to instead promoting their own specialty, something beloved across their own cities. Today we call it ham. Anyway, it wasn't just foods ready to eat that would take off during this period. We also see the introduction of salt-based condiments, some of the first stuff unequivocally produced not for nutrition but strictly for adding flavor. And among the earliest examples, there's one that comes from right here, in the region including southern China and Southeast Asia. It's simple, the same recipe as salted fish, except in this case, the fish is allowed to ferment in the brine for long enough to dissolve. It would become a necessary topping, something that with just a few drops could elevate what had been a simple bowl of rice into a delicious meal. Of course, I'm talking about fish sauce. This is a place called Le Dalat, a Bangkok restaurant serving classic Vietnamese cuisine, and a place we filmed an entire video last fall. One of my favorite ones we've ever done, and somewhere I've been hoping to come back to, and finally we have an excuse. I don't know if fish sauce is originally Vietnamese. I mean, it goes back there as far as the archaeological record, but it does in China too, where it was the primary condiment in use until the Buddhist revolution pushed a vegan diet, and fish was replaced with soybeans. Regardless, this is something as old as it gets, and by now, a ubiquitous seasoning here in Thailand and the flavor of Vietnam.
I can smell the fish sauce from here.
So we're doing something right.
We're doing something right. So when I messaged you and I said, hey, we're doing a story on salt, we'd like to showcase fish sauce.
Yes.
Choose whatever you want,
Yeah.
whatever you think will represent it
Yes.
best. Why did you choose these two?
Well, first of all, for the fried rice, it's the only dish that uses fish sauce by itself, and nothing else. You know, no sugar, no nothing, and then just fry it up, straight up. You know, and then with some ingredients like Vietnamese sausage, Chinese sausage, carrot and peas, and omelet.
I mean, honestly,
it's a very pure dish.
That's very much like, even in Thailand, the original recipe of pad kapow. You
Yeah.
use fish sauce as the seasoning.
That's right.
That's it.
Yeah, that's
You
it.
know, yeah.
So as simple as it gets.
This I don't know.
Now this is a little more complicated. Because we have to prepare the sauce first, and of course the star of the sauce is the fish sauce, and then you add the usual suspects like lime, sugar, and chili, and then you mix it together, and then you marinate it, this prawn in that sauce.
You know, it's interesting, after like thousands of years of fish sauce making the foundation of Vietnamese cuisine, that's sort of how the flavor has evolved to incorporate that. This does not taste as fishy as I expected, because you have the sweetness from Chinese sausage, Vietnamese sausage, both made with salt. You have the egg to soften it up, you have the vegetables. Delicious.
In the centuries after the first Egyptian ships carried salted fish across the ocean, salt, or its use in food production, brought riches to civilizations around the world. While trade had previously focused on valuable items like gold and saffron and, again, salt, this was commerce focused on the masses, volume products, something not just kings but everyone wanted, needed, and could afford. The market was endless, and so were the list of cultures ready to step in to fulfill demand and fill their nation's coffers. There were the Chinese, who were the first to nationalize salt production, instituting a state-owned monopoly in the year 119 BC, and using salt revenue to finance construction of the Great Wall. India would establish its own salt monopoly during the years of the Mauryan Empire, a practice which would continue for almost 1,000 years until the end of the Gupta dynasty. The Macedonians under Alexander the Great earned a fortune from their discovery of salt deposits in the mountains of what's now Pakistan, used for thousands of years by the civilizations of the Indus Valley and still sold to the present as Himalayan rock salt. The Celts became so wealthy from the ham trade that in later years they'd be referred to as the Gauls, a derivation of the Latin hal, meaning underground salt. And this legacy is still visible in old Gallic settlements like Austria's Hallstatt, Halleck in Ukraine, and Galicia in northwest Spain. Salt would be the economic engine behind West African kingdoms like the Mali Empire, where it was said that the city of Tagaza wasn't just financed by salt, but built entirely of salt structures. And then there were the Phoenicians, who didn't produce salt themselves, but instead became exclusive trading partners with the Egyptians, selling their goods across the Mediterranean and in exchange, sending Egypt things like dyes, jewels, and the finest wines. But in the halcyon days of the trade in salted goods, nobody took it as far or benefited as much as ancient Rome. There's an argument to be made that the narrative of the Roman Empire is really just a story about salt. I guess the best way to start is with the words of Pliny the Elder, who wrote, and I quote, "By Hercules, life cannot be lived humanely without salt. All the charm and greatest humor of life we refer to as salts because it rests on this more than any other." Now, Rome itself, like all ancient cities, was founded near a salt works, in this case a relic of the ancient Etruscans. They'd build an even bigger one at Ostia around the 7th century BC, and within 100 years, it would be taken over by the Roman government, who took their profits from selling salted goods and used that money to go to war against Egypt's old distributors, the Phoenicians, destroying Carthage and taking over the Mediterranean salt trade. The Romans knew full well the financial power of salt. They built one of their biggest roads, the Via Salaria, from their salt works at the Tyrrhenian Sea all the way to the Adriatic on the opposite coast. They created their own condiment, similar to the Asian fish sauce called garum, made from fermenting fish with salt and adding herbs like coriander and dill, which would become a key component in almost all recipes found in the first Roman cookbook. Hell, a garum factory has been discovered in the ruins of Pompeii. The Romans paid their soldiers partially in salt, which is, of course, where we get the word salary, and also the word soldier, an old French term with the same Latin origin. They salted their vegetables, hence the word salad. Salted their meats, which is where we get sausage. And speaking of salted meats, nearly every Roman polity marketed their own regional delicacies to trade and earn money, both in today's Italy and as far as the empire stretched. This introduced the world to everything from Parma prosciutto, to Genoa salami, to Iberico ham, first made by the Gauls with Egyptian salt sold by the Phoenicians and brought to the world by Roman traders. And it wasn't just meats. Roman dairy farms salted their cheeses for preservation as well. See things like Pecorino Romano and Parmigiano Reggiano. And that should give you a pretty good idea where we're heading for our next meal. I don't really have anything to add. It's salted meats and good cheese. The same stuff enjoyed for more than 2,000 years by everyone from the Gauls to the Romans to Kit, our enthusiastic Thai server who helped us choose his favorites from this vast and incredible category. The first recorded war over salt took place around 3800 BC in what's now China's Shanxi province, where a great salt lake known as Yuncheng would evaporate every summer and, much like the Dead Sea, provide easy access to its bounty. This war between the local Chiryo tribe and the forces of the great Emperor Huangdi was also the first war ever recorded in China, and marked both the beginning of Huangdi's reign and the foundation of the modern empire. It's commemorated in stories and monuments, reported widely in history books, and nobody seems to mind that it didn't actually happen. I mean, somehow no one seems to notice that in the oldest Chinese language accounts of the battle, there are fights between the rain spirit and the wind spirit, flying generals, monsters on top of mountains, and battle plans drawn up by the goddess of war. Hell, even Huangdi, the winner, never actually existed and is a mythological figure. But the lake is real and really was critical to early China. And even if this salt war never happened, well, the rest of history would be full of plenty of others to make up for it. There were, of course, the Punic Wars between Rome and Phoenicia, which we already mentioned. And Phoenician salt came from the Egyptians in large part because of their old wars with Nubia, a 500-year fight that saw the Egyptians finally take over ancient Nubian salt mines. Maybe the biggest belligerents when it came to fighting over salt were the Venetians, who fought battles against neighboring city-states to eliminate any competition. After all, it was money from their overpriced salt which financed their lucrative spice expeditions to India. And of all places on Earth, perhaps the city which saw the most violence related to salt was Timbuktu in today's Mali, for a time the richest salt trading city on the planet, and which would change hands 4 times in barely 2 centuries, with control passing from the Mali Empire to the Tuareg, the Songhai, and the Moroccans between 1340 and 1591. And with the arrival of Europeans to the New World came more salt wars. The colonists coveted the native salt manufactories. There was the battle that led to the expulsion of the Shawnee from Indiana in 1803, where the tribe had been harvesting salt for 1,000 years. And shortly thereafter, it was the Cherokee pushed out of Texas over an area now called Grand Saline. And those are just the wars. There were even more domestic rebellions. Anger against the ancient Chinese salt monopoly led to a revolution beginning in 874 that would overthrow the Tang dynasty, though the monopoly itself would survive until 2017. A rebellion in Spain against Philip IV's proposed salt tax lasted for 3 years in the 1630s and led to the law's withdrawal. And less successful was a Russian uprising in Moscow in 1648, also protesting a salt tax, except this time it ended with not just widespread punishment against the rebels, but the installation of Russia's first printing press, so that the penalties for evading the new law could be posted across the empire. But of all the salt rebellions, 2 stand out, etched in history forever, with the first beginning in France in the year 1789. For centuries, the French, like the Chinese and Indians and Venetians, had enforced a state salt monopoly, with prices and taxes fixed by the monarchy. But the laws were applied unequally, with certain provinces forced to pay taxes exponentially higher than others. This caused friction which came to a head in the aftermath of the Anglo-French War, when Louis XVI raised both quotas and taxes to an impossible level to rebuild the royal treasury. Protests mounted and the king backed down, agreeing to listen to the recommendations of an upstart group of regional representatives who called themselves the National Assembly. Under immense pressure and with the National Assembly supported by members of the clergy and his own army, he announced he would follow their demands and end the salt monopoly. But he didn't. His own family, including his aristocratic wife, Marie Antoinette, insisted he prove his authority and hold his ground. You probably know what happened next. As for the second, well, this brings us all the way to the 20th century in colonial India. Of all the resources claimed by the British, it was a monopoly on salt that would ultimately lead to independence. At first, when a lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi announced a planned protest against the salt tax, the British didn't take it seriously. This was, after all, a cheap product and not something the crown valued. But Gandhi knew better, saying in his words, "Next to air and water, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life." He would teach the king a lesson once learned in that old Slovakian fable. Anyway, Gandhi organized a non-violent march that would last 24 days and span 387 kilometers, with the intention of evaporating his own salt in defiance of the British law. He would reach the salt flats of Gujarat at 8:30 in the morning on April 6th of 1930, and this would be the spark that would light an unstoppable flame. Thousands, maybe millions of Indians joined the protests, and that very same day were making their own salt. The British didn't know how to respond. In one instance, in Peshawar, the colonial police opened fire, killing more than 200. Gandhi would be arrested, as were more than 60,000 others. The British held him for 9 months before releasing him from prison in hopes of tamping down the uprising, but the die was cast. 16 years later, the British were gone. India had its independence, and the so-called Salt March, or Salt Satyagraha, would inspire more nonviolent protests around the world, most famously in the United States, led by Martin Luther King Jr., who credited Gandhi's Salt March as his direct inspiration. Anyway, let's get back to the topic of food. The first electric refrigerator would be invented in 1894 in Hungary, which would revolutionize food preservation. But this refrigerator and the ones that would follow over the next 2 generations had the nagging problem of leaking poisonous ammonia and sulfur dioxide, which rendered them unsuitable for the average household. It would take until the 1930s before anything resembling what we know today would be introduced, using Freon as a coolant and first sold widely in the United States. In other words, every single dish created, cooked, or sold from the beginning of human history until well into the years of plane flight relied either only on local ingredients or used items dried, smoked, fermented, pickled in vinegar, or preserved in salt. Now, over the centuries, as wet markets took hold, there was obviously a preference for using fresh stuff, but that wasn't always possible. In some climates, winter meant things like vegetables might be inaccessible, hence the enduring popularity of things like kimchi in Korea. Elsewhere, societies that spread across the world wanted a taste of home, which is why in all parts of the old Portuguese Empire, from Macau to Mozambique, you can find bacalhau, salted cod. Some places relied on ingredients that might only be found seasonally, like, for example, salmon to the Scandinavians, caught when they'd swim back to the rivers to lay eggs and preserved through salting, giving us the iconic gravlax. By the middle of the 20th century, salted ingredients were no longer strictly necessary. Refrigeration had become commonplace, everything could be shipped and stored fresh, and even our biological need for salt could be handled with a simple salt shaker on the table, as salt harvesting was now a modern industry and the weight of even containers full of salt was no issue for modern logistics. But what didn't change was our palate. 12,000 years was a very long time for us to get used to certain foods and dishes, and even if we didn't need them anymore, we liked them. Sure, we can buy fresh cucumbers from Australia to Argentina, but we like pickles. Hell, we prefer them. There are, of course, old dishes lost to time. I mean, fresh bread is unequivocally better than hardtack. But maybe what's more surprising is how many of those ancient foods stuck around, ingrained in our cultures and embedded in our regional identities. And with that, it's time for our next meal.
The last thing you think about with food like this is salt. It's such an afterthought. I mean, you put salt on your potatoes, but like, this is sausage made from salted meat, and like the word sausage comes from salt. This is sauerkraut, which is an example, obviously, of a really old school form of pickling vegetables for preservation using salt. You know, it's like, this dish is just a big plate of things made possible by salt. And one more use of salt, we have bacon in the mashed potatoes, appropriately so. This is not a vegan-friendly meal. I made short work of this. I just blinked. I've been like talking to the camera, you know, and like saying some random stuff that'll probably never get used. And then I look down and there's like an inch of sausage left. And we still have a couple of meals to go today. So I guess that speaks well of the food. Yeah, German sausage, sauerkraut, potatoes made with bacon, and some sauce, which is mustard-based. Yeah, this is really good.
In the second half of the 17th century, 100 years before the storming of the Bastille, France was ruled by Louis XIV, who would reign for 72 years, the longest of any monarch in recorded history. Now, as hard as it might be to believe when we're talking about somebody French, King Louis was a little bit arrogant about his food. He was said to despise any strong flavor that might mask the taste of his favorite dishes. So he would place on his royal table just the two ingredients he deemed necessary. Those would be salt and black pepper. As tends to happen in absolute monarchies, the preferences of the king quickly reached the general public, and before long, salt and pepper could be found side by side in homes across France, then Europe, then the New World. Now this, the widespread ubiquity of salt as a table condiment, obviously couldn't have happened if we hadn't also made advances, both in salt production and shipping. All throughout history, cultures experimented with techniques of better ways to isolate salt. Early Americans from the Yucatan Peninsula developed a method of burning certain types of grasses, soaking the ash in water and then letting the water evaporate. We also see examples from throughout history of various methods used for salt mining, including the ingenious method of pumping water into the salt mines to create a brine, easier to bring to the surface through the earliest uses of hydraulics, found in China as far back as 800 BC. And maybe the biggest change in ancient salt production came near the end of the first millennium AD, when various cultures, from the Khmers to the Venetians to the natives of what's now Chile, independently came up with techniques of speeding up the process of getting salt from seawater through the use of multiple evaporation pools, side by side, with the water moved from one to the next as the moisture reduced, allowing each pond to be constantly refilled, and production to move at our pace, not the sun's. By the time of Louis XIV, we didn't need to rely on the sun at all. Advances in mining showed us not just how to remove vast amounts of salt from underground, but opened our eyes to the fact that we didn't need to find salt on the surface to start digging. It was pretty much everywhere. And our coal-powered furnaces could boil huge amounts of salt water in no time, turning the ocean into a giant grocery store for all the salt we could possibly need. Shipping was also no longer dependent on caravans and small boats either, with the oceans long crisscrossed by enormous vessels capable of withstanding the weight of as much salt as we could haul on board. And when the first railroad started operations in 1825, well, it was only a matter of time before anything could reach anywhere in any quantity. Now, here's the thing. The accessibility of salt wasn't supposed to happen. We're literally wired to crave the taste of it because our bodies need a small amount for survival. But that small amount is like 500 milligrams per day. Today, we eat a lot more than that. The country with the highest salt consumption per day is China at 17.7 grams per person, or about 35 times what's actually required. Hungary and the Czech Republic come in second and third, and even right here in Thailand, thanks in large part to fish sauce, it's about 13 grams daily per person. We eat too much salt, that's just a fact. But this isn't meant to be a moral discussion or a sermon on watching our sodium. I'll leave that to the doctors and the fun police who tell us that we should live longer. Instead, I'd rather focus on the fact that it's an absolutely incredible achievement, a testament to our own ingenuity, and the result of thousands upon thousands of years of innovation, creativity, wars, rebellions, and pretty much every step in our development as a species that brought us to the point where everyone has access to salt without even thinking twice. That's incredible. And so for one more meal, well, why not go for that salty treat that might be the most popular comfort food across the entire planet? This is a place called Easy Burger, my personal go-to spot in Bangkok for a burger and fries. Here it's as straightforward as it gets, a good burger, dry-aged using salt, topped with salty cheese, salted pickles, and a homemade secret sauce, which also, of course, uses salt as a component.
Can you tell me a little bit about just seasoning as a guy who makes burgers, as a chef, as somebody who knows food, right? You know, we take salt. We think about salt as something that you use as seasoning. You know, you take the salt shaker and you put salt on something. The interesting thing about doing this video has been kind of looking into, like, I always used to say on the channel, like, you know, Thai food doesn't really use a lot of salt. It seasons with fish sauce.
Yeah.
Fish sauce is salt. Soy sauce is salt.
Yeah.
Pickles are salt, right? Anything that you see that's basically like, if it's salty because it uses salt.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how different food would taste without that magic ingredient?
I mean, day and night, salt is. I mean, I'm a big salt lover. I mean, it doesn't only. It just makes food taste better. It's not only salty. It just makes other flavors stand out more. It makes sweetness come out more. It makes the beef taste beefier. It's not just only salty. It makes other flavors like stand out more.
You might not notice when salt is on a dish, but you will notice if it doesn't have any.
Immediately.
As a Belgian, does it bother you that the world calls these French fries? What do you call them on your menu? Are they French fries or they're just fries?
They crinkle cut fries, but they're Belgian imported ones. So yeah, there's that.
In 1607, when the first permanent colonial settlement was founded in the United States, in Jamestown, just a short drive from my hometown in Virginia, the first commercial building constructed, the first building of any kind after houses and a church, was the salt works. The need for salt to preserve whatever food was on hand came before the lumber mill, the blacksmith shop, the tailor, the school, and any of the other services that would allow a new society to begin to function. It wouldn't take long before American salt was drawing settlers from Europe to cross the ocean. Remember, at the time, the chief driver of the global economy was salted foods, and the Atlantic, with its bounty of fish like cod, well, it was this, more than the often told story about religious freedom, that actually caused the new colonies to grow quickly. Dutch settlers set up their salt works along the Hudson River in a place we now call New York City. British around Boston built massive salt factories and cod fisheries, and when the Spanish settled Florida, it was salt they were actually after, not the fountain of youth. When the colonies went to war for independence, the British targeted American sources of salt, trying to starve out the rebels. So Benjamin Franklin snuck off to Bermuda, where he negotiated a secret deal for salt to be smuggled in, out of sight of the English blockade, to ensure no disruption in local supply. And in the 1860s, at the advent of the Civil War, both sides set out to attempt to cause the other to break by attacking each other's salt works. But they took two different strategies. The Confederates seized control of as many northern salt factories as they could reach, but this meant the North could send in more troops and take them back. The Union took a more permanent approach, with General Sherman implementing a policy where all Southern salt facilities should be destroyed on sight. This meant for the Southern Army, rations dwindled and starvation became common, and in the end, it was the lack of food, as much as any battle, that caused the South to surrender. If you go back far enough, there are similar stories of how salt impacted pretty much every country as it exists today. Just like salt-based dishes, it's more than we could ever hope to include in one single video. In 2003, a writer named Mark Kurlansky published a book about the importance of salt in global history. It's an incredible piece of work, around 400 pages spanning much of human development, and it reads like a fast-paced narrative, and still, it could have been 10 times longer. The more you start to climb into the rabbit hole, the more it turns into the story of all of human civilization. And that's just salt in commerce and war and politics. When we start talking about cuisine, it becomes even more impossible to quantify. When I make videos like this, there are usually a few comments from people saying things like, "Oh, you missed this dish," or "How could you have skipped this?" or stuff like that, reminding us that our narrative is incomplete. Let me save you the trouble. I know, it's salt. We could have literally done anything, because wherever you are, whatever your language or religion or background, your favorite food probably contains salt. From the ancient tribes of the Amazon River to the Mongolian steppe, from the Middle East to the United Kingdom, the Sahara Desert to our own backyard in Bangkok, without salt, entire cuisines would look completely different. But it's not salt as a component in the world's best dishes that makes it so incredible. It's the path it took to get here. The thousands of years that took this gift from the oceans and underground and allowed our society to grow, advance, and develop. It's an ingredient that is definitely worth its salt. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below for our Patreon and social media. So long.